Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together to give a big, warm Rochester welcome to the Pope's astronomer, director of the Vatican Observatory, Motown meteor man, Brother Guy J. Consolmagno.
Thank you. Wow. It's great to be here. And have I just destroyed this? I think I will leave this where it was. There are two microphones here, and I probably just destroyed one of them. I'm delighted to be here. I have had such a wonderful time here. It's also great I've got family who are able to come and see this as well. Before I go into the talk, I want to show a short movie to give you an idea about the Vatican Observatory. And I think it's great to have a film because you can see some of the places we work and some of the things we do. And besides, I think the guy who narrates this does a great job. Both science and religion are conversations about the universe. They're ways of learning how we interact with this universe. It's not simply a question of, is there a God, but there is a God, now what do we do? It's not just a question of, there are a bunch of stars, but rather, why are there stars? How do they work? How does that tell us how things work here on Earth? The interaction that I see in my own life is that religion gives me the reason to do the science.
Back in the papacy before Francis was Benedict, and one of his lines in a final elocution to the fathers of the General Congregation was, "Go to the frontiers." Well, there isn't much more frontier than 3.7 billion years away.
The first official interest of the Church for astronomy started in 1582 with the reform of the calendar. Then in 1891, Pope Leo XIII wanted to have an observatory to show that the Church is not against science, but the Church promotes good science.
They start out by having telescopes on the Tower of the Winds, and then on the walls surrounding the Vatican, as the city lights grow, and as the Italian government gives them back the territory out in Castel Gandolfo. In the 30s, they build new telescopes on the roof of the Papal Palace in Castel Gandolfo, best telescopes of their era in the 1930s. By the 1980s, light pollution makes those telescopes unusable, so we build a new telescope in the dark skies of Arizona.
I'm Father Jean-Baptiste Kikwaya Eluo. I'm working in 3 projects. The first one is NEOS, Near Earth Object. So what I'm doing with NEOS is just observe them using our modern telescope VAT. The second project is meteors. I worked on very faint meteors, what we call shooting stars. And the third project is a set fireball network. They will have 4 cameras here around Tucson so that actually we can monitor any fireball getting into the Earth atmosphere in the region.
This telescope, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, it was the first of the new technology telescopes that has been considered pretty much the norm now in developing telescopes. With the advance of computer technology, we have the capability of bringing that advanced technology directly into our telescope. So it's an expandable, it's almost like it's a living machine, so it can grow as technology grows.
It is still very important to maintain scientific research at the Vatican, simply because there is still a lot of confusion about this relationship between science and faith. We are not out here trying to prove the existence of God by looking through a telescope. That's not what we're doing. But we can say that if we want to obtain any reasonable results looking through that telescope, we need to do it embracing a certain work ethics that is, in fact, the same work ethics that the Bible itself tells us through commandments and through the Gospels to embrace.
Human beings look at the stars and wonder. They want to know, what is that? What is that about? How do I fit in? They hear about the moon landing, and they want to know, what was that like? If we're part of the human race, we're part of the race that went to the moon. We're part of the species that looked at the stars and wondered, what the heck are those things? Looking at the sky reminds you that there's more to the universe than what's for lunch. What's more, if you believe in a universe that God so loved that he sent his son, then not only are you going to want to study the universe because it's kind of cool, it's an act of worship. It's an act of getting closer to the Creator and getting closer to a universe, as St. Athanasius said 1,500 years ago, was cleansed and quickened by the Incarnation. Then, doing science is an act of worship.
So, I hope that if you have a chance, you want to follow up a little more about what the Vatican Observatory and its foundation does. You have a chance to go online, Google The Catholic Astronomer, and we have a blog that has a lot of links to interesting things that we do. I did want to give you an idea of who I am and how important astronomy is to the Church. This is a photograph of the annual meeting at Christmas time of the Courier, the group who run the Catholic Church. And this is basically where the Pope spends his time telling all those cardinals they're spending too much money. If you look carefully in the very, very back, that's me, in the absolutely back row, but I'm in the room. Astronomy has always had an important role in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church invented the university system in the Middle Ages, and before you could go on to do your final studies in theology or in philosophy, you had to take a series of courses, the trivial courses, rhetoric and logic and how you speak. You'd have to have a set called the quadrivium, which included music and arithmetic and geometry. But one of the courses was astronomy. And in those days, astronomy was the cosmology of the Earth surrounded by spheres that contained the other planets, each sphere assigned to a rank of angels that would move it. If things are moving, they must be alive, there must be something moving it. At first they thought those were gods, and they named them for Jupiter and Saturn and such like. But by the Middle Ages, they had assigned this motion to angels. A fallacy that many people have about this picture is that they think the Earth is at the center, and therefore the most important place in the picture. But if you remember Dante, hell is underneath the Earth, which makes it even more central than the Earth. And I don't think anybody thought that Hades was the most important part of the universe. It's actually the other way around. The Earth is not at the center, the Earth is at the bottom of the universe. This picture permeated not only astronomy, but the rest of culture in that time. And C.S. Lewis, you probably know C.S. Lewis as the popular writer, he had a day job. And his day job was being a professor of Renaissance and medieval literature, first at Oxford, then at Cambridge. And he wrote a series of lectures published in this book, describing the immense beauty and harmony and how this view of the universe, this cosmos, tied philosophy, theology, music, astronomy, all together in one coherent whole. And as he comments, it was the most remarkable creation of the human intellect. It only had one problem. It wasn't true. But beyond that, it seemed to unite everything. Copernicus, in the 1500s, suggested that you could do the math a little bit easier and maybe even represent reality by saying that rather than having all these spheres going around the Earth, they're going around the sun, including the Earth. But if the Earth goes around the sun, as he suggested, then from one time when you look at the stars and the Earth is on one side of the sun to 6 months later when the Earth is on the other side of the sun and you look at the stars, the motion of the Earth should make the stars appear to shift. And no one was able to see that. In particular, Tycho Brahe, who was the greatest measurer of star positions, looked very carefully. And here's a dome. We're sitting under a dome. There are 180 degrees from one side of the dome to the other. Every degree can be divided into 60 minute parts of a degree, what we call minutes. And every minute can be divided into 60 second minute parts, which we call seconds. Tycho Brahe was able to measure star positions to better than 10 seconds, and he saw no shift in the stars from January to June. Either the stars were immensely far away, and they had really good reasons to think that wasn't possible. They were wrong. They actually are. Or else the Earth wasn't moving. He rescued all of the cleverness of the Copernican system by having a system where the Earth is at the center, the sun goes around the Earth, and all the other planets go around the sun. You cannot make any telescope observations of the planets and tell any difference between this system and the Copernicus system, because really they're the same thing, just with a different origin point. Nonetheless, in 1609, many years after this, Galileo comes on the scene. Now, Galileo was sort of the Carl Sagan or the Neil deGrasse Tyson of his era. He was a fascinating person. Many people had talked about a system where the sun is at the center, but Galileo was the first one to go on public TV. Well, actually, it wasn't TV so much as the parties that rich people would hold in Rome, and spread his ideas in books written in the popular language of Italian. If you want to know a lot about Galileo, I highly recommend this recent biography of him. There are many, many books. This one, I think, does a great job of explaining especially his early life. To put Galileo into his context, here are some key dates, and these all rush right past you, and you sort of, yeah, there's Copernicus, and there's Galileo, and then he went on trial, and then he didn't go. Look at the dates. Where it says 1616, imagine it's 2016. This is a key moment in Galileo's life when he's kind of at the height of his popularity, but he's also finally called in for the first time by a church theologian who says, maybe there's some problems with what you're saying. So imagine that he was living today in 1616. He would have been born in 1964. Do you know anybody born in 64? You can imagine that person would be the age that Galileo was at the height of his fame. The Copernicus book that he's talking about dates back for World War II. Remember, the Copernicus idea was not something new. It had been around for a very long time and not caused any problems to anyone. Indeed, the whole Council of Trent came after the Copernicus book came out, where they were looking for heresy everywhere, and they didn't find any heresy in it. Galileo's final trial isn't going to happen for another 15 or 16 years. This is the time period. So when you have the idea that Galileo was somehow, immediately squashed by the church, it's a whole lot longer and more complicated than that. And if I were to spend the rest of the time talking about Galileo, I wouldn't get to where I want to go. So what I can do is I can recommend that Heilbronn book, or if you want a shorter version, there's a short chapter, it's actually a pretty long chapter, in this book by a good friend of mine, Paul Muller, and me, called Would You Baptize an E.T.? It's such a good book, buy 2 copies. The thing that makes Galileo special in all of this is he's working with the telescope, and this is his telescope. But he's working with more than a telescope. There were other people who had telescopes, and indeed other people who looked in the sky with telescopes at the same time as Galileo. But what Galileo also had was an Italian education in the arts. He knew how to see in 3D and how to portray what he saw in 3D. Where Thomas Harriot, who had actually done this a year earlier, draws a little childlike scrawl that you can barely recognize as the moon, Galileo paints beautiful watercolors that makes it look like a sphere. He managed to discover a number of things that he publishes in his very first book, comes out in 2010. He sees the craters on the moon. He sees that nebulae, things that look like fuzzy bits, are actually collections of stars. Some of them really are fuzzy bits. He assumed that if I had a bigger telescope, I could turn all of them into stars, but no, some of them really are still fuzzy. He didn't know that. He could see the stars in the Pleiades, more than 6. He could see dozens. Most excitingly, he sees moons going around Jupiter. For the first time, he's seeing things that go around Jupiter and not going around the Earth. That's exciting. For the first time, he's seeing things that the ancients never talked about. He came to Rome. He had a wonderful exhibit in Rome. He set up the telescope on a hill south of the Vatican. He impressed all of the important people in Rome, including the Jesuits, who looked through it and said, yep, he's right. There was Lord Chesney, who invented on this occasion the word telescope to describe this instrument. This picture comes from the 400th anniversary celebration that was held at the American Academy in Rome. They asked me to come and give a talk, and I just have to mention the American Academy is a group of people, scholars who come and spend a year doing a sabbatical. And there are a couple of people who are in charge of making sure they get everything they need, and one of them, the guy in charge of the history group, was just a typical history professor, kind of portly, tweed suit, patches on the elbows, and he's showing me around where we're going to have this party, and he says, you know, there's a little room over here that I've always thought would be a wonderful place to have a little disco. You know, I used to do some DJing when I was younger. I go, yeah, right. I looked him up on the internet. In the 90s, he was the lead guitarist for the Lemonheads. Strange things happen to you when you get older. Of all the things, though, that I could talk about Galileo, what I want to concentrate now are 3 fundamental shifts in the way that we understood cosmology. That old picture becomes shattered. First is what I call the Golden Age mentality, and this is something I stole from Paul Gabor, who you saw in the film. The second was the fact that for the first time you needed to use instruments to make discovery, and I stole that idea from somebody else. And third is the change in the standards of proof, which I stole from Paul Muller. So all good ideas come from somebody else. Golden Age. I live in Rome now. When you take the train into Rome, you look out the window and you see the aqueducts. The aqueducts have been there for 2,000 years. You go into Rome and you see the Colosseum. The Colosseum's been there for 2,000 years. Let's say it's 1300 and Rome has got a population of a few thousand, and you're surrounded by these artifacts from before anybody you know can remember, and you've got just a few written things describing the glory that once was Rome. And it's painfully obvious to you that there was a golden age in the past, and we have lost it. And this picture that in the past we knew so much more and now we know nothing. It's in Scripture. It's the story of Adam and Eve. It's in Greek stories. It's the story of Atlantis. It's obvious that things have worn down, and if you can only hold on to books from the past, Maybe you can get that knowledge from the past, but will never be as good as they were in the past. And just ask any old person and they'll tell you that these kids today, what do they know? Not like when I was a kid. With the scientific revolution, this changes. The old picture, let's see if I can, that knowledge is gradually fading away, is broken down when Galileo says, here is knowledge that no ancient person ever dreamt of. Did this really make a big effect? I mean, was it just the scientists or a couple of people who noticed, yeah, there are a couple of moons, who cares? Shakespeare writes a play in 2012, Coriolanus, I think. And in one of the scenes, Jupiter appears to our hero imprisoned. And when Jupiter appears, he has 4 aides who are going around him. 2 years after Galileo describes the 4 moons going around planet Jupiter. The other shift is that now we see a universe where we don't think the great knowledge was in the past, except if you're reading the ancient astronaut books. But the opposite idea takes hold, that, boy, they were stupid in the past. Boy, I'm so much smarter than they ever were. Boy, things are getting better and better and better, and by the 19th century, we've got steam engines and electricity, and nothing can stop us now. We even have a theory, evolution, which you can extend in ways that Darwin never intended, to explain why it is that I'm rich and you're poor. Well, it's natural selection. It's only natural because I'm naturally superior to you. And if I want to improve the human race, only people who look like me should be allowed to breed, as long as I can choose who I get to breed with. Certainly, what we have to do is to make sure that those inferior religious people, people from the south of Europe, people from the east of Europe, people with vowels at the end of their name, like Consolmagno, we've got to keep them out of America. Because science says this is how we will improve the human race. It was called eugenics. The only group that publicly would oppose eugenics was the church. And so people said, well, I guess the church must be against the best science of the day. Well, in the 20th century, we saw where that best science of the day led to. But this myth has shifted from a golden age in the past to a golden age that's yet to come. The second thing, the idea that we can use instruments in the way we discover things. If I say that Jupiter has 4 moons, you could rightly say, yeah, right, you're making that up. And if I tell you, well, look through my telescope, how many people here actually have tried to use a small telescope? And I don't mean having a friend set it up and point it, but you trying to find it yourself. It can be really, really nasty. Galileo had an episode. He traveled from Padua, where he was living, down to Florence to try to get himself a job in his old home, which he did. On the way back, he stops off in Bologna. All the rich people in Bologna come out. He sets up the telescope. He says, come look at the moon. And he doesn't have a good tripod. Nobody can see a thing. Somebody writes a very sarcastic book about how this is all a hoax. Another thing that happens with a telescope. I heard this from a friend of mine, a very good amateur astronomer, who as a young kid, 16, made his own telescope. No adult supervision. He made his own mirror. He built his own tube. He set it all up. He bought a lens, over the mail. And for the very first time, he sets it up and he looks at Jupiter. And he's so disappointed. Because there's Jupiter all right, but he sees these dots of light on either side of Jupiter, and he thinks, oh no, there must be a crack in the lens. Well, of course, he's seeing the moons. Nobody was there to tell him those were moons and not a crack in the lens. But then no one was there telling Galileo that it wasn't a crack in the lens. How did he know that? How do you know that something you're seeing is real and not just an artifact of the instrument? A third change, which didn't actually happen until after Galileo, was the idea of what counts as proof. Galileo is arguing that Copernicus is right. The old philosophers are arguing that Copernicus doesn't work. The Tycho Brahe followers are saying, you know, the evidence is... What constitutes proof? In the philosophy of the day, you had to satisfy rigid logical arguments. In mathematics, you have to satisfy rigid logical arguments. And then once something is proved or demonstrated, it's irrefutable. We know now in science that's not how it works. The best we can do in science today is to argue that one explanation is more likely, more probable than the other. And if you're good, you can work out the mathematics of how probable it is. And you will say that a result is 3 sigma, there's one chance in 100 that it's not true. Or 5 sigma, there's one chance in 1,000. But when you're dealing with thousands of data points, having 1 in 100 wrong means that there's going to be many of those data points that turn out to be wrong. How do you deal with that? You always in science say, this is the best explanation we have now, and we'll buy this until something comes along that makes me revisit it. But that concept of truth didn't exist in Galileo's time. Indeed, there's a very different sense of how nature ought to behave. Before Galileo, in the medieval world, the motions of the planets are caused by angels, by free spirit. Nature is alive. Now, imagine you go out every morning to pick up the paper, and there's a cat that lives in the neighborhood. You may even leave out a little bowl of milk for the cat. And every morning you pick up the paper. As you go in, the cat dashes up to the bowl of milk, gets a drink. And one day, you could take the paper, and there's no cat. And you're going to say, oh, that's interesting. But it doesn't feel to you like the universe has suddenly shifted radically, because cats are like that. On the other hand, if every day you take the newspaper and drop it on the table, and one day when you let go of the newspaper and it doesn't fall, you're not going to say, well, newspapers are like that. The universe, after Galileo, becomes a mechanical universe, one where you think you can make strong arguments, but never perfect arguments, and one where you can have strong expectations of how it's supposed to work. Galileo's role in the 3 shifts: he introduces new data that no one had ever seen before. He introduces new instruments of discovery that no one had used before. And he's not quite there in this new understanding of how you demonstrate truth. The fact is, Galileo didn't have the goods, and most astronomers of his day, judging on what they wrote, did not accept the Copernican system, not because the church told them not to, but because their own science said, we don't understand how this can work. It's not until Newton comes along with his laws of physics, which incidentally turn the universe into this mechanical universe. Only then does the Copernican system get adopted. And really, it's not even Copernican system, it's Kepler's elliptical orbits controlled by Newton's laws. In the process, that unity of theology, philosophy, and science is completely shattered. There is an attempt by some theologians to recreate this unity by using science as a basis of their theology. God becomes the guy who designed the watch or the guy who wound the watch. But a God who is only a watchmaker, a God who is only a watch winder, is not the God of Scripture. It's not a God of love. It's not a personal God who would be involved in your life. And what's more, as you try to invoke God to explain things that otherwise you can't explain, you're very likely to realize, wait a minute, I can explain those, I guess I don't need God. And that becomes a road to atheism. Jump ahead 400 years. Here we are orbiting the Earth 400 years later, using the laws of physics that Isaac Newton gave us, examining the planets that Galileo first told us about. This is obviously a view from a space shuttle, planet Earth behind. We put it up there because, given the sun rising behind planet Earth, you can see that very thin layer of air between us and the vacuum of space. You can see how small, how fragile, how possible it is to disturb that air that we all need so much. Climate change is a global problem with grave implications, environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of goods. It represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. Its worst impact will be felt by developing countries in the coming decades. That's Pope Francis in Laudato Si. Let me take a few minutes to talk about climate change. It's very popular to say that it's a liberal conspiracy. It's an idea that was, invented in order to sell some liberal bill of goods. Part of the problem is that there's famous Carl Sagan. It's based in some part on his work, but it's his scientific work, not his pop work. He used it as a way of explaining the observation that the surface of Venus is much hotter than it ought to be and cannot be explained except that the atmosphere of Venus is able to trap the heat that comes from the sun because of the carbon dioxide in that atmosphere. This building I'm showing you is the Earth Sciences building at MIT called the Green Building. That's where I was an undergraduate and again a postdoctoral fellow. And this fellow here, Ron Prynne, one of my professors, was someone who has worked on the effects of solar input into not just the Earth, but many other planets. But the idea goes back even before the 1970s when I was a student there. A friend of mine found this in Reader's Digest for November 1956, an article that reads, "What's happening to the weather?" And basically, I don't know how much you can read of this script there, it's basically describing the climate change and the idea that carbon dioxide is responsible for it. Everything that people are saying now, they were saying in 1956. What's more, you read further about that time, a little bit earlier, there is in the Science in Review articles about climate change in the New York Times, again, of the 1950s. According to a theory which was first developed half a century before then, despite nature's way of maintaining the balance of gases, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is being artificially increased as we burn coal, oil, and wood for industrial purposes. This was pointed out by Dr. G.S. Callender about 7 years ago. Dr. Plas develops the implications. In fact, this article references work going back to 1861. Work by Tyndall. So I looked up Tyndall. Who was Tyndall? Tyndall was an interesting character. John Tyndall. Born in 1820, died in 1893. He was Irish, but he was a Protestant Irishman. He worked out the first balance of energy in and energy out, infrared light being trapped by gases in the atmosphere. He basically had the theory of global warming in the 1860s. And also, just to show that he's not some crazy liberal that the Pope Francis is going to buy, he was viciously anti-Catholic and didn't want home rule for Ireland because he was afraid of the priestly horde performing unspeakable crimes on the poor non-Catholic minority. Which reminds you that, of course, yes, science and human beings and politics have been involved together intimately. That's also not something new in our generation. The encyclical Laudato Si. What does that name come from? It's actually based on the opening words of a poem of St. Francis. Laudato Si, praised be you. Praised be you, my Lord, with all your creations, with all your creatures, especially Sir Brother's Son, who is the day and through whom you give us light. And he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor and bears a likeness to you most high. Praise to you, my Lord, through Sister Moon and the stars. Praised be you, my Lord, through Brother Wind, through the air, cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Water, very useful. Praised be you, my Lord, through Brother Fire, through whom you light the night, and he is beautiful and playful and robust and strong. Now, I recognize many of you probably haven't read the encyclical. You may have read about the encyclical. When you read the encyclical itself, what's interesting is it's not really what you might have expected. I have a brief outline here, which basically I swiped the slides from Sister Linda, who was nice enough to send them to me and give me permission to use them. I want to run through them pretty quickly, each chapter, basically highlighting the important points. The first is that in this encyclical, the Pope is depending on the best science of the day. But the Pope is not telling anyone that this is truth, that we all accept this science and no other, that we're even telling you what to do. The Church does not presume to settle scientific questions or to replace politics. Science is good. Politics is good. We need these things, and it's not the role of the Church to supplement them. What it calls for is not a change in technology, but a change in humanity. The gospel of creation. The earth is not ours to do with what we want. It is ours to care for. This goes back to the book of Genesis. Creation accounts suggest that human life is grounded in three fundamental, intertwined relationships with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth. Everything is interrelated. In order to renew our relationship with nature, we have to renew humanity itself and have a true understanding of our place in the world. Christianity, with its rich deposit of truth received from Jesus Christ, offers just this way. The environment means more than nature, more than oceans and trees. It includes the human environment. This kind of integral ecology means that everything, not only nature but also culture, are intertwined. Do you see how this is, in a way, harking back to the unified view of nature that existed before Galileo? And yet, very specifically, doesn't call for a new unified one picture that has one science, one philosophy, one view of how things are actually going to work together. But it is calling for a healing of the breach that happened in the scientific revolution. The interconnectedness should be reflected in the way we live our lives. What kind of world do we want to leave to our children? We all need to come together to find answers, to implement strategies. I put it this way. If I do my job right, you have no idea what my politics is, because my politics is totally irrelevant. But usually when I do that, all the people on the left think I'm on their side, and all the people on the right think I'm on their side, and that's fine. You know, I'm also in the fundraising business. I'll take money from both of you. But I do have friends on the left. And I've noticed that they're very good at identifying serious problems that need to be addressed, and often really terrible at coming up with answers. And if you don't like their answers, they think you don't understand the problem. And I know my friends on the right, when they're at their best, they can come up with good answers. But more often than not, they refuse to admit the problems. And both sides make me want to cry, because we need both. When we have an economy that only measures one factor, the amount of dollars, we lose track of the other factors that are also important to us. Anyone who has made a choice of jobs on, I'd rather live there even though the salary is half as much, knows what I'm talking about. I'd rather do that work even though they're not going to pay as much, because you couldn't pay me to do that other work. That's what we're talking about here. There is a connection between ecology, education, and spirituality. It's a challenge, but we're in the education business. We should be able to do that. We each have a message to convey. We each have an importance. I mean, you want a really stupid, wrong answer. Human beings cause the ecological crisis. Therefore, if we got rid of all the human beings, we wouldn't have this problem anymore. There is a certain flaw in that logic. And yet, it's true. The world groans with every new birth, as Paul Simon puts it, and yet every new birth is also a joy. All of us can contribute to each other and to the world just by being alive in ways that justify that little bit of carbon dioxide we put out with every breath. So, let me summarize all of these points we've gone through so quickly. First of all, the encyclical is not just about global warming. It's not just about ecology. These problems are symptomatic of economic problems, social justice problems, and all of those are symptomatic of the fact that we are sinners. You know, it's called original sin. Original sin is one of those doctrines that nobody understands, but anybody who denies it hasn't read the paper this morning. It's very Jesuit. He's a Jesuit. I'm a Jesuit. He uses these buzzwords that I get. You're finding God in all things. This description from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. It's really the same words that he's using in Laudato Si. So he's talking about a universe that we love because God created, and a universe in which we can find God. And what he's calling for is a new ethic. Technology, it's not a technological problem. You're not going to solve it with a technological fix, any more than you can solve original sin with a technological fix. Ecology is more than just save the whales. We are not gods, but nature is not gods either. And basically, if you don't find something that disturbs you, that makes your hackles rise, reading this, I don't care what politics, what you believe, how green you are, how rational you are, everybody is going to find something in this that makes them go, oh, yeah, but. I mean, he has lines in there about how he really, really doesn't like air conditioning. He doesn't live in Tucson, come on. Surely that's different. Well, I think it is different. And there are places you can argue. But do I really need to live in Tucson? Well, actually, yeah, I'm an astronomer. But to really, we can start arguing these things back and forth. What I've done is had solar cells put on the roof of our house in Tucson. Here are some points that I want to bring out. Science and faith, this ecology viewed as a scientific issue, and ecology viewed as an economic issue, and ecology viewed as a faith issue. If you want to build bridges, have you ever noticed bridges always have equal sides? They're always horizontal. These ideas can only be brought together if each of them are recognized as equals. It's a wonderful quote, and I wrote it down as a quote. I have no idea who said it, and I can't find it even on the internet now. But it's by the light of God we see our shadows. It's by recognizing the theological side of the issues that we can see the places where we're not letting the theology shine. And one of these is the idea that scientists are human. The myth of Newtonian physics and what came out of Galileo is that the science is independent of the scientist. I can look through the telescope and see it. You can look through the telescope and see it. It's there. It doesn't matter who's looking. But in fact, that's not really how science works. Galileo writes this great philosophy of science that says, we should be guided by the facts. We should be guided by the observations. We should only believe things when there are data. And probably you may have learned that in your science class. Sounds great. Galileo himself didn't believe that, act that way. He believed in the Copernican system 15 years before he had a telescope, on the basis of, it sounds really cool, it must be true. And the thing is, he was right. The way most scientists work is to have an insight that they have no idea where it comes from, but it seems right enough to them, they believe in it enough that they'll spend the time and the effort to check it out. Question I get all the time, Guy, you're at the Vatican Observatory. Do you believe that there's extraterrestrial life? That's exactly the right question. It's a question of belief. I don't have the data. But I believe in it enough that if somebody at the observatory says, I want to study this, I'll give them the resources to look. If you ask me, do you believe that little green Martians are flying in flying saucers? No, I don't believe. And if you want resources, you'll have to go look someplace else. Because I don't believe everything. By the light of God, we see our shadows. Our problems are not technical problems. They don't have technical solutions. They're deeper than that. When I read that, I was reminded of a wonderful poem, and I'm just going to quote a small bit of it, by T.S. Eliot, one of the choruses in a play he wrote called The Rock, where he's writing in the 1930s where people had come up with fascism, that's going to solve our problems, communism, that's going to solve our problems, scientism, that's going to solve our problems, technocracy, that's going to solve our problems. All of these movements, and he describes them this way, they constantly try to escape from the darkness outside and within by dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. Doesn't that sound like too many of our political and economic pipe dreams? If people are not going to be good, you can't come up with a system that counters it. But the man that is shall shadow the man that pretends to be. The other thing that comes out of Laudato Si, that comes out of this new marriage of science and ethics, science and faith, science and the fact that when we are insulting the earth, we are insulting it. Since the beginning of time, God has revealed himself in the things he's created. That's St. Paul, letter to the Romans. And if you scribble on a Bible with a crayon, that's no different from polluting the universe that God has created. G.K. Chesterton has this marvelous, marvelous bit. The essence of pantheism, the old Roman ideas, was that God, the earth was our mother, nature was our mother. But the point of Christianity is this: nature is not our mother, nature's our sister. Now, nature was a solemn mother to the followers of Isis and Cybele, to Wordsworth, to Emerson, but to St. Francis, nature is a sister, and even a younger sister, a little dancing sister, to be laughed at as well as loved. What does it mean for us to wholly embrace the idea that nature and us are siblings together, children of the same Creator Father? How do we treat nature in that sense? So if we can begin to warm up the projector, I'm going to end with a little story about nature and my own experience. Many years ago, more than 30 years ago, wondering why am I doing astronomy when people are starving in the world, I had this totally goofy idea of running away from all my problems, joining the Peace Corps, going off to Africa, where the Africans told me, by the way, this is why you do astronomy. We want to know. Everybody wants to know. It's what makes us human and not just well-fed cows. But the fact of the matter is, I am not an adventurous person and never have been. You know, one who serves to swell a scene, start a progress or two, and move on. My idea of a great vacation is to be in a cabin in the woods where it's raining, so I have a good excuse not to go outside. And instead, I can sit and read, adventure books, read science fiction. So I find myself in Africa. I'm doing Africa training in the Peace Corps. And I'm thinking after about a month, Guy, you're crazy. What are you doing here? Whatever made you think this was a bright idea? And what's worse, I'm homesick. I am phenomenally homesick. I am so homesick, it's painful. I'm getting physically ill from my homesickness. Now, the Peace Corps has a deal. The day you say you want to go home, they put you on the next flight home. No questions asked, no responsibilities. They're happy to let you go. They don't want you there if you don't want to be there. No pressure to stay. And I'm lying in bed, and I think the time has come. Obviously, I made a mistake. Got to go home. I'll tell them tomorrow morning. But if I'm going tomorrow morning, I've never seen the Southern Cross. I grew up in Michigan looking at stars. I had this little H.A. Ray book, The Stars. Fabulous book if you want to learn the constellations. And I had learned all the stars growing up, the winter stars and the summer stars, and I could find my way all around, but I'd always wanted to see the Southern Cross. And here I am at the equator, far enough south I ought to be able to see it if it's above the horizon, and I pull out the book and I look up. When will the Southern Cross rise? I can see it tonight. It's the middle of December. I can see it tonight at about 4 in the morning. So I set the alarm clock to wake myself up at 4 in the morning. I'll go look at the Southern Cross, and then at 7 in the morning, I'll tell the Peace Corps people I'm going home. And if we can bring up the projector and turn off. I got up at 4 in the morning, and these were the stars that I saw. You're looking behind me to the south. And directly overhead is a little set of 4 stars that looks like the Southern Cross, but it's not the cross. It's called the false cross. The real cross is over on my right, your left. It looks like a little kite, 4 stars. Do you see it? And then 2 bright stars pointing straight down to the horizon. That's Alpha and Beta Centauri. And I was thrilled. I'd finally seen the Southern Cross. What could be more wonderful? But then I decide just to take a little bit more of a look. I look around to the other side. There's a splash of light. My gosh, it's the Magellanic Clouds. And then I look off to the west, and lying on its back, I can see the 3 stars of Orion. Orion is setting, but there it is. And the dog next to Orion. I remember that, and the twins. And I remember them. And I look over my head to the north, and there's the Big Dipper. And the handle of the Dipper bends around and arcs to Arcturus and continues on and spikes to Spica, and rising behind it, beginning to rise, are the 3 bright stars that are going to come up as I wait half an hour, the southern summer triangle. In fact, at this moment, there are 20 first magnitude stars in the sky, and I can see 15 of them. This is the most glorious moment you can see of the sky. And my breath is taken away, and I suddenly realize I'm not homesick. I'm home. Where I can see the stars I know, I am home. But it goes deeper than that. There are a lot of spiritual writers who will say, of course we feel we're longing for heaven because we don't believe we belong in this universe. I'm sorry, I disagree with C.S. Lewis when he says that. I do belong in this universe. I belong in this glorious universe that God so loved that he sent his Son. He didn't send his Son to save nice people or philosophical ideas. It's because he loved the world. This is the universe that was cleansed and quickened by the incarnation. This is the universe that is sacred because it has been touched by God. This is the universe that is God's child, and I am God's child within this universe. This is the connection between the human and the divine in the creation where the divine has expressed himself to all of us who have eyes to see and hearts to respond. Thank you very, very much.
about 3 times as many as we expected. So that plays to the impact that this talk had on the community. We also, at this point, if anyone has any questions, I'll run around with the microphone and we can try to get those answered if you would be willing. Brother Guy? Anyone? Hands? Yell if I'm not seeing you.
There's one hand over here. No. He's just waving. Okay, no, he was just waving at me.
Hand over here. Okay. Anyone? Questions?
Right. 42, that's the answer. What's the question?
Where are we?
I recently read that Pope Francis was a scientist. What field was he in? Do you discuss?
I haven't actually talked science with him. The only really informal conversation I had was when he came over to the observatory for lunch a few years ago. We've met briefly. We've chatted. He literally signed the paper that appointed me, but I don't chat with him every day. His scientific background is that he studied chemistry, but more as what we would call chemical engineering, and worked briefly in that field before going into the priesthood. But he's familiar with science. He's more to the point, he's literate enough to be able to understand scientists who can explain what's going on and ask the right questions. He's a Jesuit, of course he knows these things.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Questions?
There's one over here.
Oh, right over here.
Yep. Wait for the microphone. Yeah.
The title of your recent book, Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? And I believe that Pope Francis said that he would.
What actually occurred, he was giving a homily based on a scripture passage in Acts when there's a big debate in the church on whether or not they should allow Gentiles into the church. And he's trying to communicate to his congregation, to the people in the audience, how shocking an idea that was to the Jews of the time. And he said it was as shocking to them as suggesting that, we should be baptizing Martians would be today. That's how alien they thought the Gentiles were. So he was using it as a figure of speech.
Oh, okay. The reason I ask is because, to my knowledge, I don't know that the church has ever regarded any other creatures other than our own species as having souls.
Well, I can counter that. Angels. The very fact that we have these creatures in our understanding of the universe, and we can argue for hours, neither of us knowing what we're talking about the nature of angels, but we do talk about another kind of creation who are in a relationship with God. You also find a lot of reference to this in the Hebrew Scriptures, whether it's the stars singing their praises to God, shouting for joy. Now, we know stars don't sing and dance, but maybe we don't know. There's even odd passages of other creatures in the early chapters of Genesis that nobody can quite figure out what they're talking about. We don't know. And given the fact that we don't know, the question is a question not that is one to be answered, but one to be pondered. Because when you ask, would you baptize an ET, the good thing is it makes you ask, well, what is baptism after all? What is it supposed to do? Does it apply in this case? What is an alien? When do I decide that something's alien or not? What does it mean to be in the image and likeness of God? And these are not questions that have answers. These are questions that we sometimes assume we think we already know the answer to until we're faced with a new situation and go, oh, maybe there's more to it than I thought. So I don't give an answer in the book. I don't claim to give an answer. I mean, if you're looking for one, all of the questions that people ask us, generally the problem is the question assumes too many things that maybe we shouldn't be assuming.
Thank you.
I know we had one over here. Oh, a couple over here. Okay. I think this person was first, maybe? I don't know.
Thank you very much. I enjoy your speech, by the way. I thought your presentation was great.
Thanks.
My question for you is a two-part question, really. It's about the possibility of integration between evolution our Catholic beliefs. We could summarize that as being creationism, if you will. So I'm asking this question because my girlfriend is a little bit stubborn on this. She says that in her Catholic church, it is a Roman Catholic church, that the priest teaches that evolution and the Catholic belief system about God can be integrated together. Have you heard of this, and do you believe that's possible?
The Pope Pius XII said that in an encyclical in 1950. Pope John Paul II reinforced that in a document to the Pontifical Academy called Truth Cannot Contradict Truth. This is traditional Catholic teaching. You can actually find this in the writings of St. Augustine going back 400 years. We actually say this every year when you get ashes at Ash Wednesday. Remember, man, you are dust. You came from dust, you will return to dust. In the words of G.K. Chesterton, there's a good way and a bad way of thinking about it. If by evolution you just mean that God did things slowly rather than quickly, well, you know, my religion tells me God did it. My science will tell me how he did it. If you are trying to take this process of how we got to where we are and draw crazy philosophical implications from it, such as, oh, I can explain why I'm rich and you're poor, and the social Darwinism that was the bane of the 19th century. There's a problem with that. But the problem is the bad interpretation of evolution. Does this mean that you have to, again, 1,000 years from now, will we be talking about the evolution of species the way that we do today? I hope not. I hope we will have learned something. But I do know that creationism is such, young earth creationism, the idea that one takes the Bible as a science book, gives way too much power to science. And as a scientist, that makes me uncomfortable, because I know how fallible science is. And if you want to turn the Bible, which is wonderful, into something that's terrible as a science book, you're really degrading the Bible. Science books, do we have any students in this room? You've taken biology in high school? Right. Are your kids in high school using the same biology book that you used when you were in high school? I hope not. Are you using the same copy of the plays of Shakespeare? I hope so. Are they reading the same books of Plato? You know, we don't have a new edition of Plato that changes everything. Some kinds of books are eternal and some are transitory. Some kinds of knowledge sit and deserve study, and others are merely mileposts on the way to an understanding that's never reached. Which kind of book do you want the Bible to be? One that you throw away after 5 years, or one that you keep for 3,000 years? Okay. Yeah. Well, the other people in the other room can't hear you no matter how loud you speak. Right.
Could you kindly comment about the Star of Bethlehem?
Ah, that's another chapter in my book. Oh, there are so many different theories about the Star of Bethlehem, and any of them could be true. And we talk about all of them. The important thing is, if you want to study the Star of Bethlehem, go right ahead and have a lot of fun with it. Don't ever think you've got the answer, because we weren't there, we don't know. And the other thing is, what was the point of the Star of Bethlehem? To point to the baby. If you spend all your time looking at the star and forget the baby, then you've missed the message. Oh yeah, there are so many different ways you could explain the Star of Bethlehem. Science has come up with dozens of answers, and it could be that none of them are true, because we weren't there, we don't know.
In the interest of the breach between science and faith that the church has been involved in, and it is now 400 years coming up from Galileo's birth, when can we expect the church to convert the process of sainthood? And I say that without a laugh. Because of the job I'm in, I've had to do a lot of research on Galileo.
Galileo is a fascinating character, and badly persecuted and badly treated. And the church has personally apologized to him, of course, a little bit late. Everything you know about the Galileo case is wrong. The truth does not make the church look any better. But the crime of the church was actually misusing its authority in going after Galileo for reasons that had nothing to do with his science and certainly nothing to do with his theology. You know, would you declare somebody a saint who has 3 kids and never married their mom? That was Galileo. Would you declare someone a saint who lied through his teeth about credit for things that he didn't really deserve? That was Galileo. Do you give sainthood to somebody who had brilliant insights and saw things that no one else did and changed the world? Because that's also Galileo. If you want to make him out to be a villain, you can do it. There's plenty of material. You want to make him out to be a hero, you can do that too. Most human beings are a mixture of both. But most people who really deserve to be called saints aren't famous and don't have hundreds of biographies written about them.
Anyone else? Other questions?
Yes. One up here.
Brother Guy, would you say something about the Antichrist?
Nope. Don't know a darn thing about it. And I know I'm not going to talk about things I don't know. People have asked me about, I talk about the beginning of the universe and the Big Bang, which was invented, by the way, by a Catholic priest, Georges Lemaitre. And I mention this because Georges Lemaitre, this incredibly brilliant, 2 PhDs, one from MIT, one from Louvain, friend of Einstein, friend of Arthur Eddington, one of the most brilliant scientists of the early 20th century, Catholic priest. He was not a Jesuit. And he hated it when people it is possible to be brilliant and not be a Jesuit. Rare, but possible. But we can talk about the past because we have data from the past. We have no data from the future. So everything we talk about the future is sheerly speculative.
Other questions?
Brother Guy, I was watching a YouTube video of you last night.
I was going to warn you, watch out YouTube videos. There's nothing but idiots on YouTube. Now you tell me it was about me, okay.
Where you said something that you repeated tonight, which is that original sin is confusing. So my question is, and I mean this with all due respect, can you reconcile science with the idea that original sin is based on the fact that there were 2 original humans who were our parents?
I don't know. The trouble isn't the Adam and Eve, because there was a time when there were human beings, and there was a time where there were no human beings, and there must have been a point where there was the first human being. You can even argue that most human beings are interrelated. This is an essential point of, just to be sure that we treat every person as a member of our family, because every person is a member of our family. Though only 9 of them got in to get seats here tonight. The bigger issue is, what if there are entities who have free will and intellect, are aware of themselves, aware of God, and choose to sin or choose not to sin, and are in need of redemption? How does that original sin work with them? And that's where I say that our theology is underdeveloped. And most theologians would say that without even worrying about if there are, aliens. And yet, anyone who's observed the world knows that there is this human propensity to do stupid things, and we don't even know why we do them, but we do them, and we wish we didn't. And we wish there was some way we could stop. It is a problem, but I'm enough. When I entered the Jesuits, they forced me to study philosophy, and I discovered, first of all, philosophy is actually really hard. And the second is that problems, unlike physics, problems are not things with answers. Problems are often things that you just have to live with and get used to and try to reconcile how do I change the way I live in order to understand, how do I change my attitudes towards others in order to understand and deal with the problems that I live with? I don't have an answer to that. But it's not really a science problem, and it's not really a philosophy problem. I think it's an observation that we live in sinful ways, in ways that we know are wrong and we do anyway. And how we reconcile that, how we deal with that, how we get repair to that. That's what the salvation of Christ is about. The hardest thing, the best news of the good news is we are redeemed sinners. And nobody wants to hear that because most people don't want to admit they're sinners, and a lot of people who are sinners don't want to admit they're redeemed. Which is, again, I think a sign of the original sin that poisons all of us.
Any further questions? We have a handy from over on this side. Anyone over here? Shot? Anybody else? Oh, got one here. Again? Must be the questions.
I waited until everybody else had their chance so that way I could ask a second question if there was allowed. So I've been thinking about this next question that came up because how you answered my question was brilliant, I think. It was very brilliant. So I really love when you do. I'm probably going to order your book when I get out of here.
Oh, good. Yes. 2 copies.
Okay. Hopefully, is it on Amazon?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's how I shop.
And if you don't remember which book, just buy all of them.
I'll check my credit card first and see if I have the funds for it. No, I'm joking. Anyways, okay, so the question I have for you goes back to my original question. It's sort of an extension. So when it comes to the idea of integrating evolution with Catholic belief systems associated with the Bible and so forth, yes, I agree with you that we can definitely say, well, yes, it does say, from dust we came and from dust we should go back. But then you also said that if we start speculating and philosophizing to the point where we're sort of creating new narratives about creation, that God was so slow in doing it. That's the kind of challenge I'm facing with it.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the creation stories, plural. There are at least 5 different creation stories I can find at least hints of in Scripture. None of them agree with each other. In terms of the science, because every one of them is using the best science of their day, and they were written at different times with different sciences. But all of them agree on what they say about God and God's role in creation. And that makes you realize, they're not stories about creation, they're stories about the Creator. Just give an example, Genesis 1. Everybody knows that in the beginning, the 7 days, all of that. That was written, as far as we can tell, at the time of the Babylonian exile, maybe soon after, when all of these Jews had been exposed to Babylonian science and Babylon's version of how the world came to be, all of which pointed to the pinnacle of creation, namely the city of Babylon, wherein the nature gods that they all believed in were fighting with each other, and by mistake the earth was created. And we're all stuff that shouldn't be there. And the writers of Genesis say, you can take the best science of the day and look at it in an entirely different way. That the stages of creation that you find in the Gilgamesh are actually this stage. That in the beginning, God's already there, so God's not part of nature. God wills the universe to exist. It's not an accident. God wills light, the very first thing, so that you can see He's not doing anything in the dark. And at each stage, not only does God will the universe to exist, but He calls it good. And you take that for granted until you realize there are a lot of philosophies that say the physical universe is evil. Chocolate is the devil's way of tempting you into obesity. Don't say, meditate yourself to a higher level. Whereas the Jewish version, which we as people of the book, Muslims and Christians, adopt, is that God creates the universe to be good. That chocolate is a sign of his love for us. And the pinnacle, the direction of the 7-day story, where does it all lead to, is the Sabbath. We were not created to labor. We were not created to sweat. Our point is not to fill our bellies like cows. We are people who are aimed at a day when we can contemplate God at rest and contemplate God's glorious universe. And that's why we were put here, and that's why we were created. What a totally different story. Using the best science of its day, using the same picture of a flat earth with a dome and water above and below the earth. You know, I once talked to an astronaut who was a seventh-day creationist, and he said, I believe this, and I go, you know, where does the space shuttle go? How come you don't get wet? Of course, what he showed me was that he was a test pilot. You don't want test pilots who creatively interpret their written documents. But we're not test pilots. We're given many different stories so that we can extract from all of these different pieces of poetry the one message that no one textbook, no one literal document could ever convey, which is the nature and the wonder of God. Only poetry can do it. I was giving a talk a few years ago, Michigan Tech, up in Houghton, Michigan. And I was saying to a kid who was asking me this question, you know, when you see your girlfriend, do you say, oh, my heartbeat has just gone up 2.3%? And of course he goes, well, yeah, that's what I do say in Michigan Tech. Okay. Most of us are not nerds. Even I'm not that much of a nerd. And we need poetry to express things that otherwise we could not express.
Okay, any other questions?
Thank you. I'm exhausted.
You're exhausted?
Yeah. Thank you all for coming. This has been amazing.
On your church to your left, there's a little reception out there. You can have a few things to eat, something to drink. And if you have brother guy can tolerate one more question or one more handshake, that'll be great. And those of you who are at the Eisenhart, please feel free to come back over here if you can. And we thank you all so much for coming to this third annual lecture, and hopefully we'll have something. I don't know if we'll be able to top this next year, but we will certainly try. Again, looking for suggestions. Thank you again. Good night.